planning practitioners using a rule-based generative analysis approach. And I'll quickly explain the problem statement, where we're coming from, give some indication of related work, the objectives that we're trying to achieve, the experiences we have collected, and then some future work. And all this using a particular case study, which is the IFOU winter school, and I will start explaining that. It's an event, it's an international collaborative design studio that we held in Singapore in January. It's organized by the International Forum on Urbanism. They have it every year almost. And it was about 170 students from 20 different universities, industrial but actually mixed functional with residential. And it was in collaboration with the JTC Corporation, which is the developer of the land. And so this is the actual problem statement. So it's about, as you can see there, this is the area. It's about 50 square kilometers or 5,000 hectares. And it's very monofunctional at this moment, industrial, segregated, fragmented, polluted of course. And they want to, or the idea is to turn it into a major catchment area for future population growth. Of course it would have to be cleaned up, focusing on a different, focus of industrial plants, including green lungs, attractive housing, etc. The reason being that, for the, let's say the worst estimates, the population in Singapore could almost double by 2050, and this is one area that could be slated for, part of that new population to live. And then, so the students in groups worked on different topics, and this is one of the topics, living at the waterfront, Team 9. I'm just showing some results to kind of explain the problem statement, what we're trying to deal with. This is actually the team that was chosen to have the best results. And so they were focusing on the waterfront, and as you can see on the left-hand side, they had some ideas about, first of all, closing off this part of the sea, basically, to make it a freshwater reservoir, opening up, adding additional canals in order to allow the water to improve accessibility, to have water taxis or other means of transportation. And then this is focusing on a different mode of transportation, mainly subway, MRT as it is called in Singapore. And in this case, they're also showing how you might identify how many people could live within a certain distance of MRT stations, so all relating to accessibility. So these are some of the images that they included in their presentation. And then, oops, sorry, going too fast. And the other part they were focusing on was, of course, the actual design of various typologies of mixed use, in this case focusing on waterfront typologies, with industry mainly at the bottom, then residential at the top, and some commercial in between. And so they had all these, let's say, nice images to show how these 1 million people could be living in that area. But some of the problems that are popping up from this is, what about quantification? From these drawings, you cannot tell whether 1 million people would actually be able to live in that area. You're also not able to really tell whether accessibility is really addressed whether what percentage of the people actually would live within a certain distance to a marquee station or other modes of transportation. And this was generally observed. I mean, this was not specific to this particular group. There was always a lack of quantified evidence, and we're thinking of quantifying floor areas, densities, travel distances, etc. And so what we're thinking, what we're suggesting is that there should be some kind of cyclical process of, well, first of course you start with data collection, and then there's a process of synthesis to create as well as generate the information that is required to be able to do then the data analysis, which is so important, but which is often absent. And then, of course, it could be continuing in the loop. Now, looking at, so what we're focusing on is parametric urban design. This is really what we're suggesting, that we're using parametric approaches to generate 3D building models, massing models from the 2D plans that might result from these urban planning processes. And of course, this is nothing that new. There have been other researches done on this, and I'm just giving a small selection. More recently, José Beiró and others actually developed a parametric urban design system, and it does provide feedback on a number of urban indicators and density measures, so it actually does, to some extent, what we're interested in, but we find one of the problems is that there's no differentiation in building typologies. And for smaller areas that might be okay, but for 50 square kilometers, it's a little bit unrealistic. The same with a work of Reinhard König. This is not so much a system, it's actually an open source library for computational analysis and synthesis, which he calls C-Plan, but he does give some demonstrations on how it can support optimization of spatial configurations. And again, there's no differentiation in building typologies, although he also worked with a colleague, Katja Knecht, did a study on the generating of building lots and buildings given a street network. In that case, they do distinguish different typologies, among them row blocks, courtyard blocks, ribbon buildings, and freestanding blocks. But the tool only allows one to select one building type at a time, only one building depth. So for each of the parameters, you can only select one value, which we'll talk was too limiting. And then, well, this is not so much a research project, though it was in the beginning, but of course there's a city engine, maybe you're aware of it. It adopts a rule-based approach. It's very much inspired by shape grammars, but it's not shape grammars, it's procedural grammars or procedural rules. It's very comprehensive in modeling different building typologies, including facades, but it primarily targets 3D visualization over analysis and assessment, although it does provide some analysis. There's still an extensive manual effort required to develop or select generative rules for specific plots, and there's limited support for analysis or export into a 2D GIS environment than besides ArcGIS. But for our students, ArcGIS is not a very good solution because they don't have access on it on their own laptop, and so they'd rather work with other GIS software. So from that, the objectives that we're trying to achieve are twofold. One is the rule-based generation of information that is explicitly relevant for the analysis and assessment of an urban plan. So for example, we're thinking about identification of number of floors, surface floors, for example, measure of usable floor space, but it could also be travel distance, etc. And looking at workflows that simplify or at least semi-automate the process of rule selection and the integration of performance analysis, for example, by exporting it to a 2D GIS environment. So we did some experiments. The first initial experiments were actually done before the winter school. They were shown to the students, they were actually made available to the students, but within the time constraints and the knowledge of the students, they were actually not able to make use of it. We selected a very limited number of parameters, such as floor area ratio, number of floor site coverage, and function, focusing on residential, commercial, office, and industrial. And so for each of these, they're all parameters, and for residential, commercial, office, and industrial are not, it's not one or the other. So you could select the different ones in different proportions, of course, and then it would generate, based on these parameter values, different results. And for that, we suggested to make use of parameter field images. These are images that could be generated from GIS using heat maps, or could be just drawn in image manipulation software like Photoshop or something else. And so it could highlight, let's say these could be MRT, subway stations. This is a major highway cutting through. Industrial could be more to the south because there's also an industrial island below it. Residential more to the north to relate to the current residential developments above the area. And then this is the result that we generated. This was just for demonstration purposes. It's actually one building typology. It's a platform and tower typology, but they're, sufficient I wouldn't say, but there are a number of parameters in it that allow at least some differentiation or variation within the typology. But in order to be able to really understand whether whether this approach is any good, we continued to collaborate with two studios. These studios followed up from the winter school. The students kept working on the same area, taking some of the ideas from the winter school with them. One was an urban planning studio, and this is one project for bit called Ecotopia, where there are three different mixed-use belts. The top one is mainly residential, middle one mainly industrial, and the bottom one is suggested to be mainly commercial. And the students, this was a group work, actually suggested or sketched some rules for building coverage, distribution, and height in relationship to roads, parks, and other boundaries. And this is for the residential belt, the industrial belt, the commercial belt, and this is in relationship to parks and other boundaries. And for the roads, they make distinction between types of roads. And so what we really did was we disambiguated these rules. We worked together with one of the students from the group, coded them as procedural rules, and then generated a three-dimensional model of what could have been if she had the opportunity, if she had access to the software during the process of the studio. And on the left-hand side is a very simple analysis of building height. This is another project that we also looked at. This is from an urban design studio. As you can see, the scale is a bit smaller, but we kind of extrapolated it for the entire area. It's called urban metabolism. And in this case, there's a bit more variety in terms of the building typologies. And I wouldn't say that this is something where I would want to live, but it at least gives a better indication of what the design results in, and this is something that could be analyzed to look at to give more quantified information. So this is the next step that we did. We used a slightly different model again, trying out different typologies, but this closes the loop. So it starts with these parameters again, pretty much the same parameters as the beginning, generating the model from it, then exporting this from 3D to 2D shape files, importing this into GIS, and then doing the analysis that we suggested, including people density, GFA, so gross floor area, and building height analysis. So this is one, let's say, solution. These are then the analyses, and also a buffer analysis. We're actually also looking at spacing tags, but haven't done that yet. And being able to tell us that in this particular area, there could be 910,000 people living. 1% of the residents would be within 300 meters of this particular point, which would be an MRT station. And depending on the size of the buffer, you have these percentages. Then looking at an alternative, let's say, for example, based on the results, saying, well, okay, but you know, we could do better. Doing the same analysis, I won't put them next to each other. You can somehow see the differences. The most interesting differences are actually in the buffer analysis, where you see that the total number of residents is smaller, but it's okay because it's not the entire area. But there are more people, almost double the amount of residents living within a certain radius of this particular point. I'm finishing here. So I should also say something about cultural DNA. So what is important is what we find really important is in order for the students to use this, we have to provide them with predefined typologies. Because still using the software to actually develop these rules to generate these typologies is quite complicated for them. And these typologies should of course reflect on the local, geographical and cultural context, and taking into account local building codes and regulations, which we were talking about this morning. So if we're looking at the Singapore context, for example, in terms of public housing, HDB is the agency that develops all the public housing. They have very specific typologies, point blocks, slab blocks, atrium blocks. The apartments, they have very limited apartment types, basically. So it's relatively straightforward, let's say, to to define these as typologies in a parametric model, so that the students can make direct use of this. Even for industrial buildings, JTC is the agency that develops all industrial buildings. They have things like flatted factories, ramp-up factories. Again, there's a lot of similarity between these, because they really focus on what works, and then just keep developing these until they find the improvements. But even for mixed use, let's say residential and commercial, podium and tower is a very prevalent type, of course. So just in conclusion, we're still doing the type of experiments, but I really would like to take this one step further and really do this into a research using a shape grammar based approach. Not only focusing on, let's say, the typologies, or the generating, but also on the representational model, which should integrate shape grammars, description grammars, and GIS, and driven, of course, by relevant analysis requirements. Still focusing on the Singaporean context, and also looking at easy to adopt interactive workflows. That's all. Wow.